Carl Sagan was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 9, 1934. His interest in science began when he was 5, when his parents took him to the 1939 New York World's Fair.
Welcome to the future and all the wonders of the 21st century in the greatest preview the world has ever seen.
Take a way ahead, look at tomorrow, just as if you were there.
For 6 wonderful months,
Pack up your family and head for the fair.
As he walked through the various exhibits and saw the inventions present, something clicked in him, and he began a lifelong affection for science. And soon, a young Sagan was constantly going to the library, checking out books about the sun, planets, and the solar system, and he also began going to museums alone as a child as well. Carl Sagan graduated high school at 16 and immediately went to the University of Chicago, where he earned a degree in physics. Interestingly, Carl Sagan had an interest in UFOs spurred on by the 1952 wave. He would often write about UFOs and ET life in his journals. And a then 17-year-old college student, Carl Sagan even wrote a letter to the Secretary of State asking about US policy regarding ETs. And Carl Sagan would debate his scientific mentor, Herman Muller, about UFOs being aliens often. Carl Sagan then went on to earn PhDs in astronomy and astrophysics from UC Berkeley. And he would become a consultant to RAND and on various NASA projects. He worked on NASA's Mariner 2, which sent a probe to study Venus.
Even more astounding news from the far reaches of space comes from Mariner 2, which roared off last August for its rendezvous with Venus, 36 million miles and thousands of hours.
And about this time, the mid to late 1960s, is when Carl Sagan would become a prominent UFO debunker. It should be noted, many in the UFO community allege that Sagan knew that there was truth to UFOs, but was an intelligence asset that played the role of downplaying the issue for the public. Let's examine some of the basis for these claims. An interesting fact about Sagan is that one of his first interactions being a scientific consultant for the Air Force came in 1958 when he participated in a top-secret project called Project A119. Project A119 was an Air Force project based out of Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico, and the project aim was to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, all in an effort to boost morale in the space race as the Soviets had just launched Sputnik. Carl Sagan was a scientific consultant to Project A119, and he was on the team tasked with predicting the effects of the nuclear explosion in space and on the moon. Ultimately, A119, the plan to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, was not carried out. I find Sagan's involvement with Project A119 interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, Project A119, as well as Carl Sagan's involvement in it, were not public knowledge until the year 2000, after Sagan had died, and this project is still not officially acknowledged by the Air Force. This demonstrates that Sagan was able to keep classified programs he was involved with a secret for life. I also find his involvement in Project A119 interesting, in that Project A119, the plan to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, sounds similar to Starfish Prime, a high-altitude nuclear weapons test that actually did take place in 1962, 4 years after the scrapped Project A119. And Starfish Prime has become a large part of UFO lore in recent years. Project A119, the plan to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, sounds like it might contain UFO briefings, given UFO interest in our nuclear weapons and the similarity to Starfish Prime. And right around that time, in the late 1950s, is when Carl Sagan's views on UFOs would change from enthusiast to skeptic debunker. Another interesting point to note is that Sagan's doctoral mentor, Gerard Cooper, for whom the Cooper Belt is named after, was an ardent UFO skeptic. Originally, Cooper had had his own UFO sighting, but after being acquainted with the likes of George Adamski, he decided that they were all nonsense. Gerard Cooper also had several contracts with the CIA to probe Soviet scientific knowledge. And like his doctoral mentor, Carl Sagan would find himself in the middle of intelligence operations of the Cold War. Sagan recounts multiple times in which scientific coalitions would be set up for him by the Air Force. And an enthusiastic young Sagan, eager to share scientific ideas, would learn after the fact that the entire meeting was set up by the Air Force and the CIA to probe Soviet knowledge. Sagan recounts that he was naive and felt used by these interactions. In 1961, Carl Sagan would be called upon to be a state witness in the trial of Reinhold Schmidt. Schmidt claimed to be a UFO contactee, and he was being tried for scamming elderly women into buying crystals. Sagan testified on behalf of the state that Saturn was uninhabitable, making the claimed contactee's story impossible. That same year, 1961, Carl Sagan was present at a National Academy of Sciences organized conference at the Green Bank Observatory, the largest telescope in the field of radio astronomy. The purpose of this conference was exploring the ways to search for extraterrestrial life. And present at this conference were many interesting scientists. Among them were Frank Drake, and this is where Frank Drake first presented his infamous Drake equation, an equation used to estimate the number of civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy. Also present was Philip Morrison, a Berkeley atomic physicist and the Manhattan Project scientist who helped organize the Atomic Energy Commission with Condon and Oppenheimer, and who was also investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Philip Morrison was also an early advocate of using microwave radios to search for aliens in space. Another attendee was astrophysicist Su Shua Huang, who coined the term the habitable zone. And another interesting attendee was John C. Lilly, who invented sensory deprivation tanks, and who was also attempting to devise a way to communicate with dolphins. In honor of Lilly's dolphin work, the scientists present at this conference would name themselves the Order of the Dolphin. And from this conference, SETI, or the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, would be born.
We're seeking the answers of those questions every human being asks himself at one time. Why am I here? Why is there a world? We will never understand these things until we have understood the birth and death of the stars, where life comes from, what forms it can take, what is its eventual destiny. You see here is by far the largest radio telescope in the world. It's a reflecting telescope with a reflector 1,000 feet in diameter. Now this means that it has a collecting area for signals from space equal in size to about 20 acres, about equal to the combined collecting areas of all the other optical and radio telescopes of the Earth. The towers you see are higher than the Washington Monument, and the structure you see high in the air, 50 stories in the air, is larger than a football field. This is what it takes to reach to the very depths of space and to see the faint signals that come to us and tell us what processes are going on out there and what may happen in the future.
And while the stated goals of SETI should be admired, they were undertaken with the predisposition that there was nothing to earthly UFO reports. And Carl Sagan was there while SETI was forming. In 1966, Carl Sagan released his first UFO debunking book titled Intelligent Life in the Universe. This book was co-released with the Soviet astronomer Yosef Shklovsky. In this book, Carl Sagan recounts many tales of contactees and his own role in the Reinhold Schmidt trial. And with this book, Carl Sagan was now a public debunker on the national stage. Now on to Carl Sagan's more concrete connections to UFOs through his association with Project Blue Book. Carl Sagan was an associate of Air Force debunker Donald Menzel, and Donald Menzel personally invited Sagan to Harvard University, where Sagan would spend many years. Carl Sagan was also an associate of CIA Robertson panel member Thornton Page, and Sagan was invited to participate in the CBS Michigan UFO debunking documentary by Thornton Page.
Talking with Carl Sagan here because he's in the same position that I was, being the only astronomer in a similar panel.
There's not a single verified or checked out report which is at all connectable with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. If you would believe, as the flying saucer cultists would have us believe, that the majority of the saucer reports are due to visitations, then you have a very strange situation. The science, for good or for ill, has destroyed a lot of the traditional theologies. And yet people have the same needs to believe that they always did, perhaps more so because of the times we live in. Well, the flying saucer myths are a really clever compromise. It's a way of having beings that come from the sky, that are worried about us, that are powerful, that are going to step in and prevent us from destroying ourselves, as we very well might, and yet have it in the cloak of science, so that no one can say nonsense that doesn't match science. It's all very pseudo-scientific. I would think that at least for the contact myths, and probably for a lot of the events of people who just see things they don't understand flying overhead, that what's involved psychology and theology, and not so much the physical sciences.
And Carl Sagan would also release a UFO debunking book with CIA Robertson panel member Thornton Page. Carl Sagan soon became a frequent scientific consultant to Project Blue Book, like Hynek once was. Sagan had served on the O'Brien panel, convened by the Air Force following the Michigan Wave, and this was the panel that was mentioned during the congressional hearing by the Secretary of the Air Force, Harold D. Brown. In many ways, Carl Sagan was the successor to J. Allen Hynek in Project Blue Book. Both were scientific advisors to the Air Force and public debunkers. Before Hynek's departure from Project Blue Book, if the public was to hear a prominent scientist on TV debunking and downplaying UFOs, they were likely to hear J. Allen Hynek, Donald Menzel, and Thornton Page. And after Hynek's departure from Blue Book, Carl Sagan would take his place in this lineup. And here is what J. Allen Hynek had to say about Carl Sagan.
Dr. Sagan, when asked the question, are UFOs for real, he said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I do not see, my colleagues do not see, and specifically physical evidence to document.
You and your colleagues, and Sagan particularly, have not studied it. Sagan and I were at Harvard together, and we were talking about UFOs. He, of course, poo-pooed it. And I said, well, what do you think about the Homer, New York case? Never heard of it. What do you think of the Monticello, Wisconsin case? Never heard of it. And I went down the line, case after case after case. You'd never heard of him, never studied him. And I said, Carl, darn it, you know as well as I do that for a scientist, he speaks on something, he should be familiar with the literature, he should have studied it. I said, yeah, he says, but I don't have time for that sort of stuff.